Welcome to the Hay Kings podcast, brought to you by Krone, dedicated to hay and forage producers. On this episode, we're joined again by Mr. Jeff Jackson. Today, we're going to talk about the warm season grasses that I really don't know very much about. I've dabbled a little bit, and you'll hear some of that. We're going to talk about millet, sorghum, and Sudan, and sorghum Sudans. The thing to know is that all these grasses are similar, in that they're C4 grasses, the nutrients, the fertilization is similar, and the traits that they have, the available traits to plant are similar. So you're going to learn about brachytic dwarf BMR varieties, and by the end of the episode, you'll know what all of those mean.
Absolutely, you're right. And we're going to draw a lot of parallel lines between these three different crops, between a good hybrid pearl millet, a sorghum Sudan grass, and a single cut silage sorghum that we call forage sorghum.
And if you were offended at the alfalfa episode that we did where we spent a lot of time talking about my operation, we're not going to spend any time talking about my operation in this episode.
So in other words, he doesn't plant summer annuals, or he really stinks at it and he gave them up a long time ago.
Oh, actually, in all fairness, I did plant a little bit of millet last year.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
And it actually, well, I learned a lot on the first go with millet. I learned a lot.
So let's just start there since you brought it up.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
So pearl millet. So for example, pearl millet seed can be somewhere 70,000 seeds per pound. Some could be 60, some could be 80, depending on the growing season. So when you consider how small that really is, John, if you had a pretty good seed bed, it would be beneficial for a pearl millet crop or some of those millet crops. You don't have to be as specific as alfalfa because, again, we're talking about putting $30 or $40 an acre in on seed right now versus $250 an acre. So it can be a little bit different, right? But The smaller the seed it is, the more we probably have to take care of that because, again, if you didn't catch it in the alfalfa episode, seed to soil contact is kind of an important thing to get moisture into the seed, and the nicer the seed bed, the better it's going to be for the seed. So technically, a rough shot, cloddy field would not be a great scenario.
Yep.
And
we're still talking about getting the weight of the seed in water into the seed to get it to germinate.
Yeah, we need to get a lot of moisture into that seed, and if it's laying in light, loose, fluffy dirt or big clods, it doesn't have good seed to soil contact, and you'll have more prolonged germination, those kind of things. So let's just get it. Again, we don't want to assume that it's just going to be this crop that we can be, I'm going to say lazy, but maybe not lazy. But if we're going to be cutting corners and trying to just save time and, well, that's good enough. You can always get more if you do a little better job on soil prep. Mm-hmm. I think that's no secret. So pearl millet, since we're talking about seeding a warm season crop, pearl millet really likes to have a warm soil. So we're talking a heat-loving crop that can go off of very little moisture and produce a pretty good crop. But we really love to have it planted at 65 degree soil temperature. And if you happen to be a little later and lean towards 70, it'll be beneficial. Mm-hmm. So if we start cutting the corners and decide we're going to plant at 50 degree soil temperature, it's not a guarantee, but there's a high likelihood that you're going to call me back and say, there's something wrong with this seed. It doesn't look good. It's not growing fast. It's like there's something wrong. Yes, there was something wrong. Got planted too early. It was too cold and you took a lot of vigor out of it and it just won't get over it. So believe it or not, you can tell when pearl millet has a hangover, it just does not look good and it won't get over it. So 65 degree soil temperature is kind of a standard practice for that. Planting depth also changes for that crop. We talked about alfalfa at 3/8 of an inch. We're going to try to do pearl millet at 3/4 of an inch. A little bit smaller, a little bit bigger than alfalfa, but not as big as these other crops. So we're going to kind of hit the happy medium in between.
Okay.
And when I visit with the people that traditionally breed and grow pearl millet, and that's what they do, that's one of the biggest mistakes that people make is they try to plant it too deep and they plant it too early. So there's two of the biggest mistakes right there is soil temperature and planting depth. So And you could say that they might get a little bit confused and try to plant it too shallow.
Mm-hmm.
But we want to try to hit about 3/4 of an inch, John. How did yours work out last year? Did you use a drill to get it in the ground, or did you go against what I just said and have this weird guilty suspicion right now?
No. I used my 750 no-till. And,
perfect.
And again, the depth control on that is just immaculate. So we got the right depth. The trouble is, and now we promised everybody we weren't going to talk about Northeast Washington, South Canada.
We can talk about it's good examples come out of it.
Sure. So we actually did get the soil temperature like the last week in May. Now you have to remember that I've seen a frost as late as June 10th. So where I talk about planting the last week in May, that is a risk.
Yes.
But last year it was hot and so dry that you couldn't even. It was a terrible hay yield for us in general. It didn't rain for 2 months after I planted that crop. We were able to get it in 65 degree, 70 degree soil temperature the last week in May. We drilled it to the right depth and got fantastic germination. It came in like a carpet. I mean, I was excited. The trouble is, we didn't get the high temperatures to really get it going. So even though we had the soil temperature because it was conventionally tilled and then we packed it and then drilled it in, we just didn't have the temperatures to really make it pop.
So your overnight lows probably got pretty cool and your daily highs weren't high enough to really get it to push.
Correct. Now, when we got to the end of August and we got that inch of rain and the daytime temperatures were in the 90s, now our problem with these crops is the nighttime temperatures are too low. And that's what I learned is the nighttime temperatures are what hold us back. It needs to stay hot overnight. You can't have it cool off for those C4 grasses to just go bonkers converting nutrients and everything into plant material.
Yes, that's something that sometimes we overlook, even as seed professionals, as we start making recommendations. Those overnight lows can really hurt more than what we would think. So,
but I'm here to tell you that on just the soil moisture that we had, I took 2 cuttings off of that and it made beautiful leafy green hay. We did have some nitrate issues.
Yes.
They were not really high, but I mean, we were talking 1,000, 1,100 on nitrates.
Oh yeah.
But again, 0 rain after we planted it for 2 months. And we still took 2 cuttings.
That's really good to hear. And yeah, the nitrate thing, having that much, I mean, you had good fertility out there and then the drought conditions on top of that would have, and to your point, that was elevated for you. When you get into some of these other areas of the country, they'd be tickled to death at 1,000 or 1,200 parts per million because they were getting, it's not uncommon to see stuff that will climb into the 5,000 to 6,000 range. So,
those kind of numbers you're not supposed to feed. Like
that needs to be blended. That's where the comment goes like this: the solution to pollution is dilution, and it takes a lot. It's like dropping it in the ocean, right? Yes. So but anyway,
rough.
Getting those things planted. What the expectations are, usually people get just a little bit somewhere in there. So yeah, I'm glad that you were able to take 2 cuttings. That's fairly impressive. But we've also had people say that they plant some of these summer annual crops and they sit in the ground for, I know one gentleman we talked about had some forage sorghum that sat in the ground for 54 days. It was that dry that it didn't germinate at all or didn't come up. Well, probably didn't germinate. And August 1st rain, 13, 14 ton of silage by the middle of October.
Jeez.
That's crazy. Yeah, well, that's 65% dry matter anyway.
Yeah, I get it.
Still, that's a lot of feed to be produced in 60 days or 50 days after that. Yes, crazy.
Let's take a break there and we'll get a word from our sponsor. Livestock prefer palatable hay and great bales require 2 things: high-quality crop and superior harvesting tools. Krone has you covered with the most reliable equipment so you can focus on the crop. Start your season with an added sense of security when you buy a new Krone. Now through May 31st, when you buy a new Krone mower, tedder, or rake, you can turn 1 year of warranty into 2 for free. See your local Krone dealer for details. And that's the story with all of these grasses, is that they're C4 grasses. They're more efficient at converting everything into plant growth than our cool season grasses are.
Way more efficient. So that's the cool thing, is they don't need a lot of water, but their water use efficiency is so tremendous, and they just love those daytime highs, and they just go crazy. So I'm glad to find out that you did fairly well on that after the fact. When we talk about getting these pearl millets planted, I will get the question a lot of times, John, and I think you kind of touched on it. First of all, we need a good seed bed, but then when we do go get it planted, how should we do it? Well, in your case that we talked about, and in most cases, when we use a drill, and it's going to have to most likely be a drill with some row units on it so you can get it in the soil a little deeper. A brilliant is not going to be the ideal implement for it, even though it would flow.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have row units to get it in the soil 3/4 of an inch deep. So there's where your seeding depth is a big deal. And in most, I would say about 100% of the time, we're just having people use a good no-till drill or a brilliant drill. You could use an air seeder if you had big acres to get across, and that would be fine. But just using an airflow machine from the co-op to blow it on and try to harrow it in, it's going to be like any other crop. Some of it will grow, I'm going to tell you. There's more than one way to get it done, but you're not going to have the best depth control. Therefore, your stand won't be as thick as it should have been based on the amount of seed that you planted. So about like anything else, if you think you're going to cut corners on how you get it planted, you're probably going to have to spend more money to get more seed on the acre so that you get more plants to give you the yield that you expect. So it's kind of one of those catch-22s. It's a trade-off. You're going to save on one side, you're most likely it's going to cost you one way or another. I guess is my point, whether it's yield and I think those shallow plants like that, they're going to get tall. We have standability issues, I think, as well. We don't get a good rooting depth. That crown's not, or that seed's not placed deep enough. And then they get a little bit more tipsy, if you will. If you're cutting hay, probably not that big a deal, but
if you're taking it to grain, it's a different situation.
For some of those pieces, it could be. So yeah, the whole planting piece, I didn't want to pass by the fact that yes, seedbed prep is a big deal, and getting it through a unit that can put it in the ground versus on the ground will be beneficial. Because much as I like to say it, I am on Hay Kings a lot, and I see comments where people would tell, I just run it through a fertilizer spreader and harrowed it in and it was perfect. Okay, that's good. It worked for you this year. You got enough moisture and it worked. But as a general 10,000 foot view, that probably would not be a planting recommendation because of some of the things that we just talked about.
Now, let's talk about the fertilizer component, because I remember there's a particular ratio of nitrogen to sulfur.
Yes. On these warm season grasses that we will talk about today, you can use the same ratio and base concept with everything. We like to have about 1 pound of nitrogen for every day that we're in the growth period. So in your case, or in most people's cases, we're going to recommend cutting their pearl millets and sorghum sudan grasses at about 40 days or 40 inches. That's just a simple rule to try to remember. If it becomes 45 days, not a big deal. 50 days, not a big deal, generally. But as a rule, if there's decent moisture, you're going to want to take it at about that time, because somebody's going to try to do dry hay. And if you get much more than that in a windrow at one time, it's going to be hard to dry.
Yeah, it won't
first
dry
and
well.
foremost. So that's one of the reasons why we say 40 days or 40 inches. So with the 40-day growth period, we would put 40 to 45 pounds of nitrogen, and we're going to balance that with a 5-to-1 ratio on sulfur. So if you have 45 pounds of N, you're going to need 9 pounds of sulfur to go in that mix. So we can use the nitrogen to make a protein and not have just a bunch of nitrate hanging out in that plant. So it's an organic chemistry process that we need nitrogen and sulfur to make protein, and that will help you with the nitrates a bunch. And after your first cut, we would like to side dress for the second cut. And if you're in an environment where you can get 3, then that's 3 different times we would suggest, because if you put 90 units of nitrogen out there, John, and you try to cut at 45 days, you will most likely have a train wreck from a feed sample standpoint that people will not be happy.
You're talking about high nitrates specifically.
I'm talking about high nitrates, and ask me why I know this, right? We've seen we get to see this movie about 14 times a year, and I'm really not liking that movie anymore. So yes, good balance on that ratio. And then when you're doing P and K, I would go off of how do I even want to say that? I'm one of those, I just put 20 to 30 units of phosphorus and 40 to 50 units of potassium out there every time I'm going, because I know I'm going to come by with another legume crop in the future that's going to need it.
Mm-hmm.
But the P and K is fairly similar to a lot of the other crops. Get 20 to 30 units of each out there. Most people aren't lacking in those. And then you do your nitrogen and sulfur and you get a pretty good mix.
Gotcha.
So that's a good point to bring up, because the fertility part of it, people have been confused at times and said, well, you know what, to avoid high nitrates, I'm just not going to put any fertilizer on. We've actually had people and or a couple of little strip trial studies that we've done that showed us that when we didn't fertilize at all, we actually had higher nitrates. And I think it comes back to the standpoint that that plant picked up what residual nitrogen was left over in the ground, but didn't have any, it's like it didn't have enough of a good fertility balance that it knew what to do with the nitrogen once it had picked it up. So by having a good fertility program out there, you could utilize it versus just picking it up and having it sit there as a nitrate hanging out, waiting for his buddies to show up.
We dove straight into millet, but there's several different options in this class.
Yeah, for sure.
What are we talking about here?
So the other piece, the pieces that I really work a lot with in the warm season annual crops would be sorghum sudan grass and forage sorghum, as very water use efficient crops that have, so I do a lot of talking to people about this too, where they might plant some other crops. So let's say we've got some guys in the Midwest that have these rolling hills with eroded clay knobs, or a little sandy spot where they continue to plant corn and the corn burns up and they get nearly zero. So what's a big benefit of some of these other warm season crops? Part of it's water use efficiency and how they handle stress. So sorghum sudan grass and forage sorghum fall into that boat for a lot of people, where they can take either multiple cuttings or one big cut. So let's stop with sorghum sudan grass and say multiple cuttings. So we have a very water use efficient crop that we can plant again in 60-degree soil temperatures, maybe 65. They work really good in combination with these winter annual crops as well, because that's about the same time they come off. And bam, we can roll right into a warm season annual with a sorghum sudan grass or a pearl millet or a forage sorghum.
So you're talking about a winter wheat or a triticale and following it up with one of these.
Winter wheat, triticale, open pollinated rye, hybrid rye, any of those. There's a lot of those crops that are going to be taken off last couple of weeks in May, first week in June as a haylage crop or a hay crop. And in certain areas, that's too late to get a good full season corn crop in. So you're just better off taking another high quality summer annual and making it work.
And now you just talked about silage too.
Uh-oh.
Yes. Now there's a couple of benefits to this. You have to worry about nitrates less with silage.
I would say, okay, yep, go ahead. I'm going to let you finish your question.
Yep, but also harvest considerations on this are drastically different than other forage crops because of the stem diameter.
Yes.
The size of the stem makes it harder to dry for dry hay.
Yes.
So I gave you a couple of things there.
Well, and let's say that we started this thing in intentions of talking about planting and the conditions and how to do it. So we talked about some fertility, and you can use basically the same thing I talked about with pearl millet on your sorghum sudan grass.
Yep.
40 to 45 day cutting window, pound for every day of growth, balance it with sulfur. The sorghum sudan grass, we're going to try to get in the ground 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep. So again, you would probably be best using a drill or an air seeder of some kind if you got large acres, to get it in the ground as a more precise depth control on a pretty decent seed bed. 60 to 65 degree soil temperature is ideal. Now we've got the crop in the ground, it started growing, and your harvest considerations do change. Again, your stem diameter on sorghum sudan grasses start to get a little bit bigger. If you're going to not crimp, probably a good baleage or a silage option right there. And that's the neat thing about them, is you don't literally have to get set on one harvest method or the other. If you get in mid-season and you need some forage and you want some wetter feed, or you just need to do it quick, swath it today, maybe take a day to wilt it, or 2 days, depending on the humidity and the temperature, and chop it and put it in a bunker. If you want to do baleage, same process. Get it off the field and get some regrowth coming. If you want to do dry hay, well, then you have to just decide if you're in an environment that you can actually get things dry. Make sure that your crimper is adjusted appropriately and lay it down wide so it will dry. But sorghum sudan grasses are very versatile. And I tell you what, John, the cheapest way to harvest sorghum sudan grass is to open a gate and graze it.
Run cows out.
Run cows right out the back door. Put it next to a pasture where you maybe have gotten your cool season grasses have run their course. And they're starting to get kind of hardened off, but you got this beautiful warm season crop right next door. Open the gate, graze it for 30 days, take them back off and let it regrow and hay it again later or graze it again later.
Now, I was kind of leading with that question, though, because, and we can relate some of those harvest strategies back to how it was planted. And where I was going with this was the seeding rate.
Yes.
Because on Hay Kings, if you get in and you start searching pearl millet seeding rate, or you do the same thing for any of these warm season grasses,
let's talk about this.
You are going to get 4,000 different answers.
From 3,000 guys. No, I'm just kidding. So, okay, pearl millet. Let's back up then once because we kind of abandoned pearl millet, but we're going to talk about it again. So pearl millet, the suggested planting rate on that generally is about 15 pounds to the acre. And on that plant type, you generally have smaller stems anyway, and they tiller like crazy. And they're so leafy, you don't have to worry about pushing that planting rate. Some people will tell me that they like to keep it at 15 pounds, but in drier conditions, again, the more seed you put out there, the more competition there is. So you might squeeze it down towards 12 or 10 or 12 pounds. And when you do the math on that, still at 60 or 80,000 seeds per acre, that's a lot. So pearl millet, generally about 15 pounds. And I would agree with you, probably the one with the most variable answer on the Facebook page would be sorghum sudan grasses by far. And that will range from 25 pounds to 100 pounds. And I've actually talked to a gentleman before that said that he planted 3 bags to the acre. So 150 pounds.
Whoa.
And it was all about stem diameter and dry down. And part of it can be, so you get some older genetics that are conventional. And then you get into this whole conversation about brachytic dwarf and BMR and palatability and digestibility and how to get things dried down. There's a wide range of what people might do as practices. The world I work in, there's a lot of sorghum sudan grass planted at 20 to 30 pounds to the acre, period.
Mm-hmm.
But most of those varieties do get to be a brachytic dwarf where there's more tillering capacity. So you don't get as big a main stem, and we get the BMR thing in there where we get higher palatability and more tillering. And
we missed the mark on this. We need to tell people where the growth point is on these plants, because that makes the discussion around stem diameter, that makes the discussion around certainly cutting height, but also some of these things that you were just talking about with the brachytic dwarf. Why are we talking about dwarf plants?
So cutting height, again, we've almost neglected pearl millet, but pearl millet, we'll go back to it. So for the third time, cutting height on pearl millet's very important, folks. A hybrid pearl millet, the longer it stands out there, the higher the growing point actually goes up or resides higher in the stem. And at about 45 days of good growth, you're probably going to need to cut about 6 inches high because the growing point has gotten that far up the stem at that point. If you decide to cut a little bit sooner, or for example, John, maybe you're going to graze it for some reason, and that's perfectly fine. That's a great grazing crop because it'll regrow very well. But you just need to know that you can't leave your cows out there till they hit dirt. They've got to be pulled out at 5 to 6 inches of growth. And you can actually take that stem and lay it down and split it with your pocket knife and kind of find where that growing point is as well. So there's more than one way to do it, but 6 inches is very important for pearl millet, or your second cut will be very disappointing because you've taken some growing points and taken them out of the field. So pearl millet's important, 6 inches.
So we're talking about setting a pop can out there and cutting over the top, bare minimum.
Right on. Absolutely. About that high. Exactly. And it feels like you've left a lot of yield out there, but if you don't leave that 6 inches, you won't get much yield to compensate for that on the second cut. So pretty important. And now you get into the sorghum sedan grass thing. And I threw out the word brachytic dwarf a couple of times. So let's talk about what that is and how that impacts the growth and the cutting height of that plant. So the brachytic trait in a sorghum plant, or even a pearl millet to that degree, it shortens the internode space between the leaves. So generally a brachytic, and you throw brachytic and dwarf together, you'll have a sorghum sedan grass that's about 6 foot tall with vegetation, and that head pops out, and then you might have a 7 foot tall plant, and that's all the bigger it should get generally. A traditional plant without the brachytic and the dwarf trait might get 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 foot tall in that same growth period.
Mm-hmm.
So from a digestibility standpoint, the most undigestible portion of a plant is the stem. So if we shorten the stem and we have more close internodes, now we've increased the leaf to stem ratio and made it more digestible.
Now, is that the brachytic portion that we're talking? What?
Mostly the brachytic portion.
We're going to have to define brachytic. How do you spell that?
BRACHYTIC. Brack, YTIC, brachytic. So we can have dwarf plants that are shorter than normal, and then when you add the brachytic and the dwarf together, you end up getting...
Okay, so brachytic is a dwarfing in plants that's characterized by a shortening of the inner nodes only.
Yes.
Okay, so that brachytic characteristic that we keep talking about is the distance between where the leaves come out of the stem.
Absolutely. So it shortens the inner node space. Yep.
Okay. And then the dwarfing component is just a shorter plant.
Basically.
Before it goes into its reproductive stage.
For the most part, yes. So you can get shorter plants that they consider dwarf, but they don't consider them brachytic.
Right. And we can go to the world of wheat to talk about dwarf and semi-dwarf varieties. In the wheat world, I mean, Norman Borlaug, the Green Revolution, his primary contribution to the world of wheat was making a shorter dwarf variety or semi-dwarf variety. So those now we're all on the same page about brachytic is the short internode and dwarf is just a shorter plant together.
Yes. And so we take those things and we just make a shorter, more compact plant. And without me being a plant physiologist and understanding why it does it, but generally those plants seem to tiller more and more prolifically than a taller plant that's just growing for sunlight to compete with the neighbors. So when we shorten those internodes, we talk about sorghums and sorghum sedan grass in particular, that we try to leave 2 nodes. So that would be 2 of those places where the leaves come out of the stem. We like to leave 2 nodes above the ground when we cut. On a brachytic dwarf plant, you can about imagine as you start stacking things down and trying to make it more compact and shorter, most of the time a brachytic dwarf a brachytic dwarf sorghum sedan grass, doesn't have to be BMR, I can get 2 nodes in about 3 to 4 inches of growth. So you're cutting that distance in half from what we talked about on pearl millet. And I've done cutting studies myself. I've cut it at 2 inches, 4 inches, and 6 inches, and anywhere over 2, somewhere in that 3 to 4 inch range, I don't really see much difference in regrowth capacity. Mm-hmm. They are quite a little bit more resilient than a pearl millet to cutting pressure and wheel traffic. So it handles that, what we see, quite a little bit better at times. So cutting height, leave 2 nodes. If you do not have a brachytic dwarf type plant, now you might have 2 nodes, could be 6 or 8 inches high.
Okay.
That gets to be pretty tough for people to fathom that they're going to cut it 8 inches high. They do grow back fairly well, but we always talk about leaving 2 nodes to get the most tillering, the best leaf material started out again right away. Yes. So cut height does make a difference.
Okay, so now we're taking this concept of the brachytic and dwarf characteristics of these plants and relating it back to our seeding rates. So if you have an older variety that doesn't have those characteristics, in order to make it more digestible, and maybe digestibility isn't the right thought process, but to have a smaller diameter stem, you do have to increase your plant populations.
In theory, that would be correct. Yeah, and that's what most people have experienced too, is that they'll take a more traditional plant style, increase the plant population so they can get better. And I'm guessing most of it's digestibility. Mm-hmm. They talk about stem diameter for dry down. And I'll tell you a quick story about that. I was walking a plot one day and I walked out of a new variety and I kind of acted disgusted. And the guy said, what's wrong? I said, this thing's got too big of a stem. It's not going to make dry hay. Now, remind you, this was in north central Kansas. He's like, oh, no, those bigger stems are just fine. We hit that with our crimper, and when you do that, they just explode. They spread open nice, and they basically are shattering stems. The bigger they are, the better they shatter for this guy. So take it with whatever you want to, guys. I tried that myself last year. I ran steel on steel crimpers through mine and had it squeezed down pretty good, and I actually had it tight enough that I was making 6-inch pieces, but we won't go there.
Whoops.
But literally, I could take something that looked like a corn stalk and get it to shatter quite well, and it dried down fairly decent, I would say. So there's different people. Again, it goes back to the machinery that you have, the environment that you're in, the method that you need to use. But John, I would agree there's a lot of contention out there on planting rates for those varieties. And I talk about 25 to 30 pounds all day long because we have very prolific tillering and higher quality plants. And it gets to be a little bit of a weird conversation because you can buy a more expensive variety and reduce the planting rate and spend the same amount of money a guy spends on a more traditional variety that's cheaper per bag. And you come out with the same cost per acre. And I would tell you that the fiber digestibility and the rate of gain on the lower planting rate of the newer product probably will get you farther. But
this goes back to our discussions on fiber digestibility being...
It's all about fiber digestibility.
It's all about fiber digestibility.
If you like to haul manure, don't worry about it. If you want them to be more efficient with what you're feeding them, then you switch up a little bit.
Right.
But yeah, it does make a difference.
Let's take a break there and we'll get a word from our sponsor.
What's up, Hey Kings? You have a lot of choices when it comes to sourcing your equipment parts, but have you tried Messick's? We have $20 million in equipment parts on our shelves, and we pick up from C&H Parts Depots daily. All this inventory is available with same-day shipping with no upcharges or expediting fees. Messick's.com has exclusive features like transparent pricing, photos of parts, fit verification, alternative part options, and an obsolete part search tool alongside the manufacturer's drawings so you're not guessing at what you need. We cover all the top brands, including New Holland, Case IH, Kubota, Krone, and Peckway, and more, all from our website. Our online tools are backed by 60-plus parts professionals who are just a call away, ready to find even the most obscure parts. So whether you're a seasoned farmer or a weekend enthusiast, think Messick's for a convenient and professional part shopping experience. Visit us at Messick's.com or call our parts hotline at 877-260-3528.
Messick's, a helping hand with your land.
You've slipped into the BMR discussion a couple of times, and that's brown midrib.
Brown midrib.
And
yes.
I looked this up, and it's a trait originally in corn.
Yes.
It was naturally in corn, originally discovered in 1924 in Minnesota. And I imagine somewhere along the line, it was transitioned over into the sorghum Sudan. Do you know the history on this?
I don't know much of the history behind it, but I think the people that were working at Cargill back in the day, in the breeding system at Cargill, maybe 70s, 80s, BMR and sorghums is not as old as it was the trait found in corn. That's for sure.
Right, right.
Because some of the people that I have worked with in the past and might even be listening to this at some point that can throw in the comments, it was later on. So it hasn't been around quite as long by a long shot. And I don't know the exact year.
Okay. But we're still talking about, this is a conversation strictly about fiber digestibility.
It is.
And we're talking about a visible characteristic, a brown midrib. So it's a portion of the plant that's darker in color, but it means higher fiber, less lignin and higher fiber digestibility.
Yes.
So as we're thinking about our variety selection, as we're in now, there's no BMR millet, right? This is a sorghum and sorghum Sudan.
We have BMR pearl millets as well.
Oh,
yes.
You do? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So we're talking about all three of these in our variety selection. We're talking about fiber digestibility. We're talking about internode, the ultimate cut height, and those kind of things are all determined by our variety selections around Brachytic dwarf and BMR varieties.
And I think the interesting thing for me is that we've done enough sampling too and comparing conventional varieties with the Brachytic dwarf BMR. We had some that we had run through the equation. So Iowa State University, in conjunction with Dairyland Labs, come up with a new equation a couple years ago that gives you a number on your test that says pounds of beef produced per ton fed. So it's not milk per ton.
Right.
It's pounds of beef per ton. So it's going to give you the beef guy number versus the dairy number. And what we saw comparing, and we sell too, we sell the traditional old standard conventional product. We don't want to exclude anybody, but when we compare our honey sweet variety, which is the old conventional, to a Brachytic dwarf BMR, there's literally twice as many pounds of beef produced for every ton of feed that you put through them because of the efficiency and the ability to digest that fiber and use some of that energy and get it through the system a little bit quicker so they can eat more and get more energy.
Mm-hmm.
It's about not being bulk filled or having a full stomach all day long. They can eat a little bit more. They produce more pounds. It's interesting.
So I'm just thinking back to our alfalfa episode. And how we put so much time and effort into, we had variety selection as part of our discussion, but we spent a lot of time thinking about that seedbed preparation. In this world, we still want a nice seedbed. That's really important. But we're trying to work through the mathematics, and it's a completely different discussion working through the mathematics on the variety because it's hard to put a value on fiber digestibility.
It is.
So that's where this conversation is much more convoluted because we're talking about three different varieties with a dwarfing trait, a brachytic trait, and a BMR trait. And what's valuable to you as a beef producer that's grazing, as somebody that's chopping for silage, going to a feedlot, or somebody that's going to a dairy, all three of those answers are different.
Absolutely. And I tell you, an interesting one for me is a story about a gentleman that what was important to him. He had been planting a more conventional, traditional product, and we introduced him to the newer stuff. And he, upon the visit after he used it, he's like, I'm planting the new stuff again. And it's one of those people you'd never expect to change, but you had to try.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And what it was for him, he's like, I'm 78 years old. I don't like moving a bale ring. And if I can put a good BMR product in there, the cows will eat that to the bottom and I don't have to move it. This other stuff, every so many days, I've got to move it because they can't physically, the palatability and the digestibility of it, they just refuse to eat parts of it. So for him, it was all about his physical condition and the utilization of those cows. And he was tired of moving bale rings. It was too hard to do.
Fascinating.
And it's fun to get to visit with growers that have seen the difference and experienced it, because I had another group of growers that I worked with that when I stopped at their farm one day to talk about an alfalfa crop, they gave me an example that they were frustrated with their sorghum Sudan grass, and they found out that I might have an inside idea. And I said, well, what happens to be your problem? And he's like, we chase this stuff. We chase around these fields all summer long to put up stored feed. And then when I go to roll it out for them to eat in the winter, they're just leaving too much of it in the field. So, for example, they're feeding hay on a pasture.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you have to go manage what they leave later on so you can have a good grass crop. So when we discussed it, we talked about going from a traditional product to a Brachytic dwarf BMR. And a year later, when I visited them again, physically on farm, they started sending me pictures ahead of time of where they had been feeding their cows the new Brachytic dwarf BMR.
Mm-hmm.
You literally could not see, if you didn't know that they had been fed there, you probably would not be able to tell that bale was unrolled in that area, because the palatability and the digestibility was so much better. They were literally eating everything that was fed instead of leaving stems scattered all over the place. So again, by getting to work with people and see those differences, we can run tests all day long, but when the cows tell you the story, it's pretty cool. So now the neighbors are going, what are you guys doing? And I tell you what, there's not a better salesperson than the guy doing it.
Absolutely.
And then it's not some sales guy giving them a pitch. It's the grower saying, this really works and we're impressed.
And I want to know how I choose between these three in a hay operation, and I want to know how I choose between these three in a silage operation.
So how do you choose? I would say most of the time, a person that knows they want to do a single cut silage crop That's what they're going to be after most of the time. So there we take what we call a forage sorghum, traditionally gets lumped in, but as a single crop sorghum, and that's going to be chopped with a silage chopper. Most people today like to do the Kemper style heads so they can be, direction doesn't matter. They could go cross the rows if they want to. There's still a few road units out there. Mm-hmm. But again, most of the time, a guy that they know that they want to chop silage, they know it wants to go into a bunker, a pit, or a bag someplace, and they're going to do it one time. So that's the key differentiator right there, is that they want a big crop. They want to take it once. And usually that's the determining factor, I would say. Mm-hmm. And it's usually going to go to a dairy, a feed yard, or somebody that's doing stored feed again for cows, that they have the ability to store it, and they're going to feed it with a wagon or through their loader bucket over the winter. The sorghum Sudan grasses and the pearl millet get to be a little bit of a toss-up about maybe the planting conditions they have. But most of those guys are going to either be chasing dry hay, they're going to be doing baleage. They might take an emergency, maybe they need an emergency quick crop, John, that they can get a pretty good cutting in 45 days. They know they're going to get some regrowth. Mm-hmm. The guys that are going to plant a multiple cutting crop, whether it be sorghum Sudan grass or pearl millet, they might graze, they might cut hay twice, they might chop twice, they might be far enough west where it's arid and dry that they can let it get a little bigger, go 60, 65, 70 days out with different plant types and still cut it for hay. But if you try to go cut a true forage sorghum for hay, the stem diameter and density of the crop, the way it's planted generally, it's going to not be as conducive to make a good hay crop. So it's going to get chopped.
Gotcha.
There are times where we will suggest people to manage moisture. They will actually swath a forage sorghum crop and wilt it in a windrow for 2 days and then run a chopper through like they would haylage. That's a big crop. It's not going to dry well, but we don't need it to dry well. We just need it to wilt enough to get down to 70% plant moisture to go through the chopper. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there are times where we will suggest using a swather to manage moisture.
Oh, interesting.
Because in the areas that we talked about before that need water and they're all irrigating, when the head emerges, they shut the irrigation off. That plant uses the moisture that's available around it, finishes the head, produces some grain, and it's ready to cut.
Yep.
In areas like I live in today that could get 30 or 40 inches of rain on any given year, you're about ready to chop and it rains 2 inches. We're talking about a warm season crop that loves moisture, and it will pick up 5 points of moisture and hold it for a month.
Oh, and that's the condition where you run your swather through.
And that's the condition where if the guy running a silage chopper says, hey, I'm going to be there on Wednesday, and you're like, I'm not ready. It's 75% moisture. On Monday, you knock her down and get it towards 70% by Wednesday and have him switch his heads and get through it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, call him back and tell him to bring his pickup header.
Exactly. And some of the silage choppers really get a little crabby with me about those comments, but at the end of the day, to do it correctly and get the moisture right so you have good stored feed, you have to do it that way.
Yep.
So making those decisions on which crop to plant is kind of about the end use.
Yep.
And if you want to cut hay or graze, then you go more towards the sorghum Sudan grass and the pearl millet side. Yes.
That's where I was going with this. And if you're just doing hay, if that's your end goal, what's the characteristic of that sorghum Sudan or millet that makes it desirable for hay?
For dry hay.
For dry hay.
Lots of leaves in my mind, because leaves dry well. And again, we could have this discussion for an hour, but probably the finer, nicer stem you can get, so it will. And if you can get everything crimped well.
Yep.
Guys have different experiences in different parts of the world. If you're humid, you might not ever get dry hay on a sorghum Sudan grass. You might have to lean more towards a pearl millet that has more leaf matter and a smaller stem to begin with.
Yep.
I would say you get where I'm at, Interstate 29, and go east. Don't count on dry hay with the sorghum Sudan grass. Pearl millet might even be a challenge.
Yep.
And they know, because there's a bale wrapper on every third corner going through this part of the country. So they know that wrapped stored feed for fermentation is probably a good idea.
Even though I'm in South Canada and colder than heck, I am going to try millet again. And here's what I'm going to do different. This year I'm going to plant my alfalfa 2 weeks earlier and my millet 2 weeks later. Mm-hmm. And my millet planting timing is going to be about the same as my first cutting alfalfa harvest.
Sure.
That's That's what I'm looking for. And then I'm going to leave it the heck alone because I already know my cool nights are going to screw me up and slow down the growth. So I'm going to try to push it into July when we get our highest daily temperatures and of course, the highest overnight temperatures going along with that. And,
Yes.
and I'm going to try for one cutting. That's a lot of tonnage. And that's what I'm going to get.
You'll probably be able to get about a good 60 days worth of growth in there, and then you'll shoot a flag leaf and a head.
Yep. And then it's time to go.
At that flag leaf stage, it's a perfect timing to maximize your quality and tonnage at the same time.
And I'm going to plant it right next to my alfalfa. So as I'm finishing up my first cutting, I'll plant my millet. And then when I'm done with my second cutting alfalfa, I'll be right there to harvest next to it.
Yep. Great. Yeah. If you can get that stuff timed up, that'd be perfect. You're right.
Put it in before, maybe the answer is to put it in before the first cutting alfalfa, or if I have good moisture, rip out the first, cut a field that I want to plant, take the alfalfa off, and then go into millet, assuming I have enough moisture. There's some playing around that I still need to do to get good at that.
Well, and to your point, we have a lot of people that will do that across the country, is take an alfalfa stand that they know that's getting wore out, take their first cutting off, and they'll either no-till right into it with a sorghum sedan grass, or they'll nuke the alfalfa and then use the nitrogen credits and the rest of the season to grow more forage. Yes.
I hadn't even considered the nitrogen credits that I would get.
So, very nice nitrogen credits.
I'll just, the only thing I'd need to add though is some sulfur, right?
Get some sulfur and make sure you're balanced. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Touch of AMS and you'll be good.
I'm excited to try this because I have the field that's right next to my new seeding alfalfa. That timing would work very, very nicely. And it's kind of has a sand knob right in the middle of it that doesn't do particularly well as it is. And it's probably 3 years over mature on the alfalfa. So we'll go in there, see what first cutting we get off, and then just no-till right into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it would work. Spray it out and no-till right into it.
Yes, and that would be my caution is for people doing the pearl millet, I believe you'd need to make sure that it's the only crop growing. It doesn't handle, I think, the competition of another crop quite as well as a sorghum sedan grass. And if that's because it's a bigger seed and has more energy to compete, I think. Mm-hmm. So just a caution there. Yes, you need it dead first.
Done. I'm having fun playing with this stuff. When it gets to 110 degrees, and it did on us 2 years ago, which is very abnormal for us, we hit 110 degrees, and the only thing that was like loving life and still green was the millet.
Absolutely. That's one thing that's beautiful about it. Otherwise, what other warm season crop are you going to grow on that acre?
Nothing.
It's going to go fallow.
It would set fallow.
Yep.
That's exciting to me to find something that we can put in that slot. It does take some rain, though. 0 rain is not an answer.
Yeah, 0 still not work.
Zero still doesn't work good.
Nope, absolutely. Well, that's cool.
Jeff, thank you for joining us again. Jeff is with Cropland by Winfield United, and he sells alfalfa seed, millet, sorghum Sudan, and forage sorghum.
Amongst others, but those are the 3 that I really get to dive in on.
So thank you again. It's sponsors like Cropland that make this podcast possible. Thank you to Cropland, and thank you to Krone for sponsoring this podcast. For more information, visit krone-na.com. Thank you to Nick Palmieri for doing all of our audio editing. Thank you to Jessica Palmieri for doing all of our social media coordination.